In the vast stretch of occupied Europe during the Second World War, a single man's fate unfolded in the shadow of a ruthless regime. He was just one of thousands, an ordinary prisoner of war, caught up in the savage current of global conflict that seemed to care nothing for the individual. His name, lost in the haze of history, mattered little now. All that remained was a gaunt figure, his face etched with the marks of suffering, eyes sunken, his body emaciated from hunger and harsh treatment. His uniform hung loosely on his skeletal frame, a mere shell of the man he had once been. The world around him was a constant whirlwind of pain, uncertainty, and dread. He had been captured months ago, during a desperate engagement between the Allies and the Axis forces, his battalion caught in a brutal skirmish that led to their surrender. The prison camp he found himself in was not one of the official ones, the ones designed to house prisoners in relative safety. This was a labor camp, overcrowded, with conditions that seemed to exist solely to break the spirits of those who passed through it. The camp was located deep in German-held territory, nestled in a barren landscape where nature itself seemed to have abandoned hope. It was surrounded by barbed wire, watchtowers, and the constant presence of armed guards whose eyes were always searching for any sign of resistance, any flicker of hope that could be snuffed out before it could ignite. The daily rhythm of the camp was oppressive. Mornings began with the harsh clang of metal gates, signaling the prisoners' forced awakening. The early hours were spent in grueling labor, mining, clearing rubble, or working in the cold, muddy fields that stretched endlessly in all directions. There was no escape, no possibility of rest. The guards, whose faces were as hard as stone, patrolled relentlessly, barking commands in a language the prisoner could barely understand, let alone respond to. In their eyes, he was nothing more than a cog in the vast machine of war, a tool to be used and discarded when no longer of value. The brutality of the camp was not just physical, it was psychological. The prisoner was a mere shadow of the man he had once been. His spirit, once filled with the hope of liberation, was now drained, its remnants scattered like ashes in the wind. He had seen men broken by less. Many of his fellow prisoners had already given up, their faces blank and lifeless, their eyes staring into the distance as if already beyond the world. Those who held on to some semblance of hope were quickly silenced, either by the guards or by the harsh realities of the camp itself. It was a place where resilience was punished, where defiance was met with violence. There was no room for rebellion here. Those who dared resist were quickly made examples of, their bodies left on display as a warning to others. But for the prisoner, the war was not just something happening outside the camp. It was happening within him. His mind had been stretched to its limits, torn between the memories of his former life and the harsh, unyielding reality of his current existence. He could still remember his home, the streets of the town where he had grown up, the faces of friends and family who had once been close. These memories had become both a comfort and a curse. The more he clung to them, the more they seemed to mock him, reminding him of the life that had been so easily taken away. The sounds of birds singing in the morning, the smell of fresh bread, the warmth of his mother's hand on his forehead, all of it now felt as distant as a dream. It was impossible to hold on to those memories for long, for the camp's harshness was a reality that demanded his full attention, leaving little space for anything else. Even his sense of time had been distorted. The days blurred together into an indistinguishable haze of cold and hunger. Sometimes, it felt as if the sun had not risen in years. Each day was a repetition of the last, the same endless cycle of forced labor, harsh words from the guards, and the crushing weight of uncertainty. There was no relief in sight, no end to the suffering. His body had become a prison of its own, weakened by starvation, his limbs heavy and aching from the constant physical strain. He had learned to ration his energy, to conserve whatever was left of his strength, knowing that each task in the camp was a battle, one he could not afford to lose. Perhaps the hardest part, however, was the way he had been made to feel invisible. In the eyes of the guards and the camp administrators, he and the others were less than human. They were nothing more than objects to be used, discarded, and replaced. There was no kindness here, no understanding. Each day felt like an eternity, and with each passing moment, he became more and more convinced that the war would never end, that he would die in this godforsaken place, forgotten by the world. His only company was the silence of the others, the hollow gazes of the men around him who had long since given up any hope of escape. They were ghosts, walking corpses, and he feared that he, too, would become one of them, slowly fading away until there was nothing left but a name on a list, lost in the annals of war. But amid this bleak existence, the prisoner did something unexpected. He began to look for any trace of decency. It wasn't hope, at least not in the way he had once understood it, but rather a search for something human, something that could remind him that not all was lost. It was a small gesture, perhaps, but the human spirit is often most visible in the smallest of acts. One day, a guard, an older man, weary and worn, with eyes that seemed to carry a burden of their own, paused for a moment and offered the prisoner a piece of bread. It was not much, but it was enough to break the monotony of cruelty. The prisoner took the bread, not out of gratitude, but out of sheer surprise. Why had the guard done this? What could possibly have motivated him to show such kindness in a place that thrived on cruelty? The prisoner did not know, but in that small moment, something shifted within him. It wasn't much, a mere crumb in the grand scheme of things, but it was enough to make him question the assumptions he had made about the world around him. It was easy to believe that the war had consumed all decency, that the only people left were either oppressors or victims. Yet this simple act of sharing, unbidden and unexpected, hinted at something else. The prisoner couldn't name it, but he felt it deep within, a flicker of possibility, a thread of humanity still alive in a world bent on destruction. The weight of the bread in his hands was symbolic, a reminder that even in the darkest of places, there could still be moments of light. Still, the prisoner clung to his resignation. He could not allow himself to believe in the possibility of anything changing. The bread was just a gesture, and the kindness of the guard was likely nothing more than a fleeting aberration. The camp was still the same, hostile, indifferent, and unforgiving. His fellow prisoners still suffered, the work still brutal, the days still endless. Yet even as he forced himself to return to the harsh rhythm of the camp, he found that the bread lingered in his thoughts, like a seed planted in the soil of his despair, waiting to sprout. It would be months before the full weight of that moment revealed itself, but for now, the prisoner could do little more than wait, resigned to the continuing nightmare, uncertain of what might come next. In those earliest days of his captivity, the prisoner could not have imagined that the decency he had witnessed, however small, would soon become the very thing that would shatter his understanding of war and humanity. But for now, it was enough to know that somewhere, amidst the brutality, there was still room for acts of kindness, even if they were as fleeting as the breath of life itself. And in that small, quiet moment, he dared to wonder, could the worst truly have passed, or was this simply the calm before the storm? The days dragged on, one indistinguishable from the next, and yet something seemed to shift, subtly at first, in the rhythms of the camp. The air had been heavy with tension since the prisoner had arrived, but now there was a change, an undercurrent of anticipation that none of the captives could place their fingers on. For weeks, life had followed a grim pattern, with only the occasional noise of marching soldiers or the distant sounds of explosions marking the passing of time. But recently, the atmosphere seemed different. The once constant hum of fear was replaced by an unsettling quiet, as if the camp itself had paused to catch its breath. There were whispers among the prisoners, fragments of rumors, snippets of overheard conversations between guards, the slightest shifts in the way the camp was run. The guards themselves, once steadfast in their cruelty, now appeared nervous, glancing over their shoulders as if anticipating something they couldn't quite control. It was as if the entire world outside the barbed wire had shifted, and now the camp was caught in the wake of that change. The prisoner, despite his fatigue, could sense that something was happening, though he could not name it. He had long since given up on understanding the complexities of the war, its shifting allegiances, its blurred lines of morality. To him, the world was as simple as it was brutal. The powerful oppressed the powerless, and his role was to survive, if only for a little longer. But this change, this quiet shift, was unlike anything he had felt before. It wasn't a shift in the weather, nor was it the result of some military maneuver that had momentarily reached the camp. No, it was something deeper, more profound. a feeling that the foundation upon which everything had been built was beginning to crumble, even if no one could yet see the cracks. Weeks passed in this peculiar limbo, and during this time, the prisoner's life grew even more unbearable. The camp's oppressive atmosphere, the constant threat of violence, and the crushing monotony of forced labor left little room for anything resembling hope. It was as if the very concept of hope had been drained from him, like water from a well that had run dry. His body was still frail, weakened by months of malnutrition and grueling labor. His face, once youthful and full of vitality, was now gaunt, his skin pale and drawn tight over his bones. Yet, despite the physical toll of his captivity, the prisoner felt something stirring within him, an old, forgotten part of himself that had been buried under the weight of despair. It was the slightest of stirrings, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He had come to understand the harsh reality of his captivity, that there were no guarantees, no promises of escape or salvation. His survival depended on his ability to endure, to hold onto whatever fragment of his humanity had not yet been lost. He had seen men break before him, their minds shattered by the relentless cruelty of the camp, their spirits crushed by the ever-present threat of death. Some had disappeared entirely, their minds lost to madness, their bodies never to be seen again. But the prisoner had clung to something, some spark of life, however faint, that refused to be extinguished. It wasn't hope in the traditional sense, not the kind of hope that people spoke of in stories or songs, but something more elemental. It was the simple will to survive, to resist the complete erasure of self. Then the unexpected happened. One morning, the prisoner was jolted from his half-sleep by the sound of voices outside the barracks, voices in a language he did not immediately recognize. The guards, who had become a constant fixture in his life, seemed to be on edge. There was a hurriedness in their movements, a quickness to their speech that hadn't been there before. The prisoners were herded into the central yard, a large, open space surrounded by the camp's tall, barbed wire fences. The air was thick with the scent of fear, the usual sounds of labor replaced by a murmur of confusion among the men. The prisoner stood, his stomach twisted in knots, unsure of what to expect. He had seen the camp turn into chaos before, but this felt different. It wasn't the usual brutality of a guard's tantrum, nor the random violence that had marked other moments of unrest. There was something larger at play, something beyond their control. As the prisoners stood in the yard, a convoy of trucks arrived, their engines rumbling as they rolled past the watchtowers and toward the barracks. The guards seemed anxious, their earlier composure now replaced by an unsettling nervousness. The prisoner could feel it, a strange tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. It was then that he saw them, British soldiers. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning, shocking him into a moment of stunned disbelief. He had heard the rumors of Allied forces advancing, but this was something he had never dared to fully imagine. The prisoner's heart raced, his breath quickened, and for a brief moment he felt as though the world had come to a standstill. The soldiers who disembarked from the trucks were not like the cruel, faceless guards who had tormented him for months. No, these men wore the uniform of the British Army, their faces tired but resolute, their eyes carrying the weight of the war but not the same malice that had been present in the eyes of his captors. The British soldiers moved with purpose, methodical and organized, setting up perimeters and taking control of the camp with a precision that contrasted sharply with the chaotic, disorganized nature of the German forces. It was an invasion, but not in the way the prisoner had imagined it. There were no loud confrontations, no dramatic moments of gunfire or resistance. Instead, it was a quiet arrival, an almost anticlimactic entry that, in its stillness, felt all the more profound. The prisoner stood frozen, his mind reeling from the shock of what was unfolding before him. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the weight of his own despair seemed to lift, if only slightly. He dared not believe it fully, dared not let himself hope, but the presence of the British soldiers felt like the first crack in the impenetrable wall of his captivity. There was no immediate chaos, no great outpouring of emotion, but the prisoner could feel it in the air, a palpable shift. The guards, once so confident in their authority, now looked nervous, unsure of what to do in the face of an enemy they could no longer control. The British soldiers, with their disciplined movements, quickly took charge, rounding up the remaining German officers and taking control of the camp with calm efficiency. The prisoner, still numb from the shock of the moment, watched as the once dominant figures of his tormentors were reduced to frightened men, their faces pale and trembling under the authority of their liberators. In the days that followed, the change became more pronounced. The British soldiers, despite the demands of their own war, seemed to treat the prisoners with an unexpected decency. They did not look at them as tools to be used or discarded. They did not see them as enemies to be treated with disdain. Instead, they extended a level of respect that the prisoner had not thought possible. It was not just the giving of food or the offering of blankets. It was something deeper, something more profound. There was an unspoken understanding between the prisoners and their liberators, a recognition that, in that moment, the war had shifted the balance of power. It was not the end of the war itself, nor the resolution of the suffering the prisoner had endured, but it was the first crack in the darkness, the first indication that the world was not as unforgiving as he had believed. And yet, despite the growing realization that salvation had come, the prisoner could not fully embrace the idea. His mind, still entrenched in the logic of survival, struggled to accept this new reality. For so long, he had been trained to expect the worst, to trust only in the harshest of outcomes. The British decency that arrived unannounced was, in many ways, the most difficult thing to accept of all. It was a reversal of everything he had known, a reversal of the moral calculus that had kept him alive in the depths of despair. He could not yet believe it. He could not yet understand the profound shift that had taken place, but in time he would. And when he did, it would change everything. The morning was colder than usual, the wind sweeping through the barren landscape of the camp, carrying with it a promise of something unknown, something unspoken. The prisoner stood among the other men, the usual ache in his bones gnawing at him as he tried to adjust to the new reality that had arrived with the British soldiers. For so long, the only faces he had seen were those of the German guards, their expressions hard, their demeanor cold and indifferent. But now, after months of suffering under the yoke of an enemy that saw him as nothing more than a disposable pawn in a larger game, the presence of the British forces seemed almost surreal. It was as though the camp had transformed overnight from a place of unbearable despair into something that, while not yet free of its horrors, at least offered the smallest glimmer of possibility. The British soldiers moved with a quiet efficiency that was both reassuring and alien. They didn't shout or bark orders as the German guards had. They didn't seem interested in making an example of anyone, as the camp's former captors had done. Instead, they spoke calmly, their voices steady, with the kind of quiet authority that comes from years of discipline and order. It wasn't as though the prisoners were suddenly treated like royalty. There were no grand gestures, no promises of comfort or reprieve. But there was something that the prisoner could not ignore, the simple, undeniable presence of decency. It was a decency that had been absent for so long that he scarcely recognized it at first. The change was subtle, a quiet undercurrent that ran through the camp like a thread weaving its way through the chaos. The food was better, though still far from abundant. The blankets, too, were more plentiful, though they remained thin and ragged. The men were allowed a few hours of rest, something they had not been granted in weeks. But it wasn't just these material changes that stood out. It was the way the British soldiers interacted with the prisoners. They looked at them not as faceless objects of war but as human beings, men who had suffered, who had endured unimaginable hardships. They spoke to them, offered them cigarettes or a kind word, something the prisoners had long since forgotten the meaning of. The prisoner himself found this hard to process. For so long, he had been reduced to a number, a nameless body in a faceless system. His entire existence had been dictated by the brutality of the guards, by their dehumanizing treatment. The simple act of being treated with basic human decency seemed like an affront to the years of suffering he had endured. How could they, these British soldiers, these men of a different army, suddenly arrive and begin to offer such kindness? It felt wrong, out of place, like a dream he could not fully embrace. His instincts, honed by months of cruelty, told him to be wary. This could not be real, he thought. There was no way that something so pure, so untouched by the ugliness of the war, could exist in this place. He had seen too much, been through too much to believe that the world was capable of such kindness. The first time a British soldier spoke to him directly, the prisoner was caught off guard. The soldier had asked him, in broken German, if he needed anything. At first, the prisoner had simply stared at him, unable to respond. It was as though the words had no meaning. The soldier repeated the question, and the prisoner, after a long silence, muttered something about food. The soldier nodded, his face serious but not unkind, and disappeared into the small cluster of other soldiers who were tending to the prisoner's needs. The prisoner did not expect anything to come of it, but within hours, a small bowl of soup was placed before him, warm and rich with flavor. It was a stark contrast to the watery slop they had been given under the German guards. For a brief moment, the prisoner felt something stir within him, a fleeting sensation, something akin to hope, though he quickly pushed it aside. He had no time for such luxuries. Hope had been the thing that had shattered him long ago, and he would not allow himself to be fooled by it again. But the soup, the warmth, the gesture, it lingered with him. Over the following days, more such acts of decency followed. A blanket was draped over his shoulders during a particularly cold night. The guards, once hostile and demanding, seemed less aggressive, almost as if they had been instructed to handle the prisoners with a certain level of respect. The meals, while still scarce, were at least nourishing. The prison yard, once a place of cruel labor and grueling punishment, now offered moments of respite, where the men were allowed to sit together, talk, or simply rest without the constant threat of violence hanging over them. For the prisoner, this was all difficult to accept. His mind, long accustomed to the constant tension of survival, struggled to reconcile the decency he was receiving with the brutality of his past. He had spent months being broken down by the war, his body and soul battered by the demands of the camp. And now these foreign soldiers, these British men, were offering him something he had thought lost forever: humanity. He wasn't sure what to make of it. The walls he had built around himself, the emotional defenses that had kept him going for so long, began to tremble. Yet, despite the kindness, the prisoner could not bring himself to trust it fully. He was too damaged, too scarred by the years of suffering to believe that this was anything more than an illusion. The British soldiers might be kind now, but what if they left? What if they, too, abandoned him, as the world had done time and time again? There was a gnawing doubt in his mind, a voice that warned him that this could not last. Perhaps the British were only here for a short time, and once their mission was complete, they would leave, just as others had come and gone before them. Perhaps they would abandon him once more to the void of hopelessness. After all, what had he done to deserve their kindness? He was just a prisoner, just another face in the crowd. But the days turned into weeks, and the British soldiers did not leave. Instead, they remained, their presence a constant in the life of the prisoner and the others. The acts of kindness continued. They weren't grand gestures, not like the dramatic rescues he had read about in war stories. They were small, everyday acts, sharing rations, offering a blanket, a cup of tea, a moment of human connection. These were the things that began to change the prisoner, though he was reluctant to admit it. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to begin to feel something beyond survival, beyond the endless fight to endure. One day, as he sat on a bench in the prison yard, a British soldier approached him. The soldier, a man in his 30s with a weary expression and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of countless battles, sat beside him without a word. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The prisoner didn't know why, but he felt an unspoken bond with this man. There was no need for words. They simply sat there, two men who had seen the worst of what the world had to offer, silently sharing a moment of understanding. The soldier eventually spoke, his voice low and steady. He asked if the prisoner had family, if he had a life waiting for him on the other side of the war. The question, simple as it was, struck the prisoner to his core. It was the first time anyone had asked him that in months of being reduced to a number, a statistic, a faceless victim of war. The question made him remember, for the first time, what it was like to be human, to be seen as more than just a survivor. The soldier listened quietly as the prisoner spoke, his words coming slowly at first, but then with more conviction. He spoke of his home, of the family he had left behind, of the life that had once been his before it had all been shattered by the war. The British soldier didn't interrupt or offer platitudes. He simply listened, and in that moment, the prisoner realized something he had been too afraid to admit. The world, despite all its horrors, still contained pieces of goodness. It still held the possibility of redemption, of kindness, of humanity. And in that small, quiet exchange, the prisoner began to understand that the arrival of the British soldiers had not just brought a new chapter in the war. It had brought something far more profound, the chance to reclaim his own humanity, to rebuild from the broken pieces of his past. The weeks that followed were not without difficulty. The prisoner's journey of recovery was slow, and the scars of the past could not be erased overnight. But each act of kindness, each moment of decency, became a stepping stone towards something he had thought impossible: healing. And as the days turned into months, the prisoner began to change. His eyes, once dull and hollow, began to regain a spark. His body, though still weak and frail, started to regain strength. And though he still could not fully embrace the idea of hope, he began to allow it to take root within him, quietly and tentatively, as though afraid of disturbing the fragile new life that had begun to grow within him. In the weeks that followed, the prisoner found himself at the center of an internal conflict that was as devastating as the physical hardships he had endured. His body was slowly regaining strength, the gnawing hunger that had plagued him for so long now replaced with the mere discomfort of malnutrition. His wounds, both physical and emotional, were still raw, but there were signs of healing, a glimmer of hope that he had thought long extinguished. Yet despite the outward signs of recovery, his mind remained in a constant state of war, torn between the past, which he could neither forget nor entirely accept, and the present, which seemed impossibly alien and foreign to him. The British soldiers, with their quiet decency and unassuming kindness, had altered the very landscape of his world, but they had not yet changed the core of his being. For the prisoner, the greatest battle he faced was not with the guards or the camp itself, but with a deep, entrenched war within him, a war that questioned whether he could ever believe in goodness again. The first challenge was the guilt. His suffering, though brutal and unrelenting, had become familiar, and in some strange way he had come to rely on it. Pain had been his constant companion, and even though he had endured it for months, it had come to define him. He had learned to endure, to resist the suffocating grip of despair, and to survive each day knowing that tomorrow could be no better, or perhaps even worse. His identity had become so intertwined with his suffering that he couldn't imagine existing without it. And yet, now, when he was offered something so foreign as decency, as human kindness, he didn't know how to accept it. He didn't know how to reconcile this new reality with the one he had lived in for so long. The soldiers offered him food, blankets, and even small gestures of companionship, but he felt undeserving of them. He had suffered too much, been through too much. How could he accept these offerings without feeling that they were somehow a mockery of the years he had spent suffering at the hands of his captors? The kindness of the British soldiers felt like a betrayal, a reminder that he had been living in the shadow of war for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to be treated as a human being. The prisoner began to withdraw into himself, pushing away the acts of kindness that were slowly being offered to him. At first, it was subtle. He would refuse food, ignore the gestures of friendship, remain silent when a soldier would speak to him. He felt unworthy of their compassion, as though accepting it would somehow invalidate his suffering, make it less real. It was a strange kind of shame, one that he could not explain, but it was there, gnawing at him, making him feel as though he was betraying something sacred by allowing himself to accept the very thing that he had once so desperately longed for. He had been a prisoner for so long, not just of the camp, but of his own despair, that he couldn't fathom a life outside the walls of suffering he had built for himself. How could he simply walk away from all of it, leave behind the pain that had defined him for so long? The very notion seemed absurd, almost as if it would erase the truth of his existence. This emotional struggle was not immediately obvious to those around him. To the British soldiers, his behavior appeared to be a natural response to the trauma he had suffered. They understood that recovery would take time, and they never pushed him to accept their help too eagerly, allowing him the space to process everything at his own pace. But to the prisoner, This time of quiet reflection felt like a battle he was losing, an invisible war where the enemy was not a soldier or a guard but his own inability to accept the kindness that was being offered. He had spent so much time in a state of survival, constantly guarding against the worst, that he didn't know how to live in a world where kindness was not an illusion. There were moments, fleeting and almost imperceptible, when he felt the weight of his own internal conflict. A soldier would pass by and offer him a glance, a nod, a brief touch on the shoulder. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it lingered, a reminder that the world was not as cruel as he had believed. Yet each time the prisoner felt the stirrings of something resembling hope or gratitude, a wall would go up inside him, a reflex that seemed to have been programmed into his very being by the years of suffering he had endured. He would immediately shut down, retreating into the hardened shell he had built for himself. The thought of allowing anyone in, of lowering his guard, felt like a betrayal of everything he had known. At night, in the barracks where the prisoners slept, the emotional toll of his struggle was even more apparent. The other men, though still fragile from their captivity, had begun to open up to the British soldiers, speaking of their families, their homes, and the lives they hoped to return to once the war was over. But the prisoner remained silent, staring into the darkness, his thoughts a swirling mix of guilt, doubt, and confusion. The others, some of whom had suffered as much as he had, seemed to accept the changes with a kind of quiet resignation. They had been broken, yes, but now they were beginning to rebuild, piece by piece. They allowed themselves to experience the humanity that had been denied them for so long, not fully understanding the magnitude of the change, but feeling it nonetheless. For them, the British soldiers represented something they had never thought possible, an end to the cruelty, a glimpse of hope in the midst of despair. The prisoner, however, could not let go. He could not understand how to move forward. The shadow of his past loomed over him like a specter, constantly reminding him of everything he had lost. He had been taught to trust nothing, to expect only the worst, and now that the world was offering him something different, he didn't know how to process it. It was as though he were caught between two worlds, the one he had left behind, full of pain and suffering, and the one that was slowly emerging around him, filled with tentative kindness and the possibility of something better. He could see it, he could feel it, but he couldn't embrace it. Not yet. It wasn't until one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the cold night air began to settle over the camp, that something shifted within him. He had been sitting by himself, as he often did, watching the British soldiers work, when one of them approached him, a man who had been particularly kind to him in the past. The soldier offered him a piece of bread, nothing extraordinary, just a simple gesture. But for some reason this time, the prisoner didn't pull away. He didn't resist. He simply took the bread, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, he didn't feel ashamed. He didn't feel unworthy. He simply ate, slowly, as though the act itself was an acknowledgement that he was still capable of receiving something, of accepting kindness without judgment. As the days passed, the prisoner began to change, though the transformation was subtle, almost imperceptible to those around him. He didn't become suddenly exuberant or filled with joy. His past was too heavy for that. But he began to let go of the constant tension that had plagued him. He began to allow the small moments of decency to take root in his heart, even if they were still tempered by the shadows of his past. There were still moments of doubt, of guilt, and of emotional withdrawal, but they were fewer and farther between. Each act of kindness, each word of understanding, chipped away at the fortress he had built around his heart. He was still the same man who had once been trapped in the suffocating grip of despair. But now he was slowly becoming something else, a man who could feel the stirrings of humanity once again, who could dare to hope, if only in small, fragile doses. The road ahead was long, and the scars of his past would never fully fade. But for the first time, he began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, he could rebuild. It was a small step, but it was a step nonetheless, and that was enough to keep moving forward. The passage of time in the camp, though never fast, had taken on a different rhythm now. The prisoner, once locked in a near-constant state of despair and internal torment, found himself at the edge of a strange transformation, though he wasn't yet sure what it meant or where it would lead. Each day felt like a quiet battle between the past that clung to him like an invisible chain and the tentative, still unformed future that the British soldiers represented. He had learned to eat the food they offered, reluctantly at first, but now with something resembling acceptance. The bread, the soup, the cigarettes, the blankets, it was all so different, so completely at odds with everything he had known for the past months, and yet it wasn't enough. The physical changes were apparent. His body was no longer as frail as it once had been, and his limbs no longer trembled with weakness.